The sky above Carthage tasted of burned grain. Not smoke, not ash. Something sweeter, then sharper. The smell of 10,000 tons of barley and wheat that had been burning for 17 days, first caramelizing, then charring, then turning into something no language had a word for, because no city had ever burned this long before. It was spring. The Gulf of Tunis usually sent a cool, damp wind across the peninsula at this hour. The kind of wind that carried salt and made the limestone walls sweat. But the wind that came tonight wasn't cool, and it wasn't clean. It came in gusts and spun in circles, because the fire had built its own weather. A column of superheated air rose from Byrsa Hill and pulled the sea breeze into itself like a living thing. The air that entered the city was not the same air that came in from the Gulf. It passed through the fire first. On Byrsa Hill, if you pressed your palm flat against the limestone wall, you could feel it. Not just heat, but a fine powder coating every surface. Calcium oxide. The limestone itself was disintegrating, calcined by temperatures that stone was never built to survive. Mixed with sweat on the skin, it became mildly caustic. It made the throat burn. It made the eyes stream. And it tasted. Those who would later survive to describe it said this. Alkaline. Soapy. Deeply wrong. This is the city that had stood for 700 years. 700 years! That is 40 human lifetimes. Laid end to end, from a person's birth to their death, 40 times over, Carthage had existed. The Phoenician sailors who founded it were dust so ancient, the dust itself had become rock. The harbor that Dido's engineers had built had been rebuilt and expanded so many times that no one alive could remember its original shape. 40 human lifetimes. Gone before sunrise. At 6 o'clock in the evening, a man named Melkart was standing at a street barricade halfway up Byrsa Hill, holding a spear. He was 42 years old. Before the war, he had traded tin and glassware from Iberia through the commercial harbor, the rectangular harbor, the one for merchants, before Rome blockaded it. He had a warehouse near the western quay. He had a wife. He had 2 sons who were old enough to fight, and were fighting somewhere below him in the smoke, in streets he could no longer see. Melkart had not slept in 4 days. His tongue was swollen from dehydration. When he closed his mouth, the dried flesh pressed against his teeth, which were coated in limestone dust. The cistern water in this part of Byrsa had become a gray alkaline paste 2 weeks ago. Collapsed mortar and ash had leached into it until it looked like wet cement, and tasted like it too. He had drunk it anyway, in small sips, in the dark. His last meal, 3 days before, had been moss scraped from the damp side of a cistern wall, and the boiled leather strap from the shaft of his spear. He had replaced the strap with a strip of torn tunic. The spear itself was wrong. He could feel it every time he gripped it. The bronze tip had been cast in the last week of the siege from melted down temple candlesticks. The metal workers had no charcoal left for the furnaces, so they had used wood ash mixed with lime, which burned at temperatures too low for a proper alloy. The bronze was soft. If he drove it into a Roman shield, it would bend. He knew this. He had known it for days. He gripped it anyway. Above him, the 6-story apartment buildings, the insulae that Byrsa was famous for across the Mediterranean, the buildings that had made Carthaginian urban engineering a wonder, had become something else. Their cedar interior frames had burned days ago, leaving the limestone facades standing like scorched shells, hollow inside. You could see the fire through the windows. Not the fire of active burning, but the deep red glow of things that had been burning for so long they had passed through flame and become simply heat. Permanent, sourceless, radiating heat. And above the hollow buildings, the sky. It was not black. It had not been black for 17 days. The fire had stained the underside of the clouds, a color that had no name, a deep, churning rust red, lit from beneath, shifting and folding as the updrafts rolled through it. From the Roman Navy's blockade ships 40 miles out to sea, the officers on watch had been recording it in their logs every night, the horizon above Carthage glowing as if the sun were setting in the wrong direction, at the wrong time, indefinitely. But inside the city, there was something else in the sky. The smell of burned human flesh. It is a specific smell. Anyone who has been close to it knows it does not resemble any other kind of burning. It is heavy, fatty, persistent. It does not rise and dissipate. It settles. It coats the inside of the nose and stays there. By the 17th day, every living person still inside Carthage had been breathing it continuously for so long that they had stopped noticing it, which was, in its own way, the most terrible thing of all. In the basement of a 6-story building on the lower slope of Byrsa, in the residential district below the temple zone, in the part of the city that had been civilian until 3 days ago, a 28-year-old woman named Alyssa sat in the dark with her 3-year-old son pressed against her chest. There were approximately 40 other people in the basement with her. Some she recognized. Most she did not. They had come down from different floors when the building above them had started to burn, and now the basement was the only place left. The air was thick. Not with smoke. The fire was above them, not immediately adjacent, but with carbon monoxide seeping down through the floorboards, with dust from the collapsed upper stories, with the shared exhalations of 40 people in an unventilated space. 2 men near the back had already gone quiet, in the way that meant they were not sleeping. Alyssa had noticed, but had not said anything. There was nothing to say. Against her mouth, she held a strip of linen that she had soaked in her own urine. She had heard from someone, somewhere, that moisture filtered the smoke. It was the only cloth she still had. Her son had stopped crying 2 hours ago. She did not know if this was because he had accepted the situation or because he no longer had the strength. She held him tighter. From the floor above, she could hear the Roman soldiers. Not their voices. They did not speak. She could hear their footsteps, methodical and heavy, moving from room to room. The sound of a door being struck open. A brief silence. Then, sometimes, the sound of something breaking. Sometimes, nothing. They were working their way down. Alyssa held on to the belief she had carried for 3 years, since the first Roman consul had arrived at the city gates with the Senate's demands. If they surrendered, they would live. Rome had promised. They had been told to give up their weapons, their warships, 200 children as hostages. They had done all of it, and Rome had added another demand, and another. And then the final demand. Abandon the city. Move inland. Leave the harbor. Leave the warehouses. Leave the sea. Leave everything that Carthage had been for 7 centuries and walk away. But at least they would live. That was what she was still holding. In 149 BC, 3 years before this night, Carthage had been the second richest city in the Mediterranean world, not the second most powerful. Power Carthage had given up. After the Second Punic War, 50 years earlier, the peace terms had taken everything military. The war fleet burned, the war elephants banned, the standing army capped. No foreign wars without Rome's permission. Carthage had accepted all of it. And then, in the decades that followed, something unexpected had happened. Carthage had grown richer than ever. With no army to fund and no wars to fight, the merchant class had poured everything into trade. The circular military harbor, the Cothon, the most sophisticated naval installation in the ancient world, with 220 individual shipberths built into the stone, and a circular admiralty island at the center, sat mostly empty, its warship hangars echoing. But the rectangular commercial harbor next to it was so busy that Roman businessmen kept offices in the city. Carthaginian grain, Carthaginian purple dye, Carthaginian metalwork moved through every port in the western Mediterranean. Rome watched this, and Rome had a senator named Cato who ended every speech, regardless of the topic, roads, grain prices, political appointments, with the same 5 words: Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. Not because Carthage was a military threat. The Romans who went to inspect the city knew that. The warehouses full of grain were not weapons. The merchant ships in the harbor were not warships. The walls were old and had not been maintained in decades. Carthage, militarily, was already dead. But it was prosperous, and it was Phoenician, and it was there, at the center of the western Mediterranean, in the position that Rome intended to occupy alone. And 50 years of humiliation had not made it disappear. So Rome manufactured a pretext. The process took 3 years and required careful calibration. Rome encouraged its ally, the Numidian king Massinissa, to raid Carthaginian farmland, just enough to provoke Carthage into defending itself, which would constitute a treaty violation. When Carthage finally did defend itself, Rome declared war. When Carthage immediately offered to surrender, Rome demanded the weapons: 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults. Carthage handed them over. Every catapult, every spear, every shield. A city that had already agreed to lose the war before it started, giving up the instruments of resistance just in case. Then Rome presented the final demand. The population must leave the city, move 10 miles inland. The city itself would be dealt with. It was only then that Carthage understood what it had been doing for 3 years. It had been systematically disarming itself for an enemy that had already decided, in secret sessions of the Senate, before any envoy left Rome, that Carthage would not survive. The weapons were not insurance. The compliance was not protection. The compliance was the point. By the time the women of Carthage were cutting off their hair to make catapult rope, their hair because there was no rope, because the weapons were gone, the war had already been decided. It had been decided in a Roman Senate chamber, in silence, months before the first Roman soldier set foot on African soil. Everyone in Carthage believed that compliance would buy survival. The reality was that compliance had bought nothing but time for Rome to get its ships across the sea. The breach had come not from the walls that had held for the better part of 3 years, not from the landward side, where the triple ring of Carthaginian fortifications was still largely intact. It had come from the harbor. The Cothon's circular inner basin, the one with the 220 ship berths, the Admiralty Island, the stone hangars, was defended by a wall on the city side. That wall was manned by sentries, but the sentries had been without food for 11 days. Not ration food, no food. They had boiled the leather straps from their equipment and drunk the water. Several had collapsed. The surviving ones slept standing up in shifts and sometimes did not wake for the shift change. A Roman officer named Gaius Laelius had been watching the Cothon wall for 3 nights through a signal fire relay. On the 17th night of the street fighting, he saw what he had been waiting for, a gap in the lantern signals. 2 sentries who did not move. He gave the order. The Marine assault team crossed the harbor mouth in small boats with muffled oars. They scaled the Cothon wall in the dark. They reached the circular island at the center, and from there they had Carthage's back. The 3-ring landward defenses that it held for 3 years had been built to stop an army coming from the west. They had never been designed to stop an army that was already inside. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the last organized street defense line on the Byrsa slopes had broken. The survivors, Hasdrubal the Boetharch, commander of the city's militia, and 900 Roman deserters who had been fighting with the Carthaginians, men who knew that Rome had a specific category of punishment for soldiers who changed sides, retreated to the top of Byrsa Hill, to the temple of Eshmun. 60 steps cut directly into the bedrock led up to the temple platform. The steps were wide enough for 10 men abreast. The walls of the temple complex were thick limestone, and at the base they met the natural rock of the hill, which fell away on 3 sides in steep cliffs. From the temple roof, you could see the harbor. You could see the sea. You could see the Roman camp, neat and geometric, on the Byrsa to the west, where Scipio Aemilianus had his tent. Hasdrubal believed the temple would save them. He believed that Roman soldiers would not desecrate a holy site, that the sanctity of Eshmun, the healing god, the Carthaginian equivalent of Asclepius, whose sanctuary had stood on this hill for centuries, would cause Roman centurions to hesitate at the foot of those 60 steps. He was wrong about this. He was wrong about many things. At 9 o'clock in the evening, a 21-year-old Roman soldier named Lucius, a Hastatus of the 4th Legion, from a Latin colony in Venusia, was standing in the doorway of a house on the eastern slope of Byrsa, with his hand braced against the frame. He had been in street combat for 17 days. His chainmail, Lorica Hamada, was no longer silver-colored. It was a dark rust brown, caked with a compound of someone else's dried blood, the oily residue of flammable materials thrown from rooftops, and his own sweat, which had dried and dried again so many times that it had become a second skin. The edge of his scutum, the big oval shield, had been struck so many times by stones thrown from above that the laminated wood at the rim had split and was held together with his belt strap, which he had rethreaded through the bronze binding as a makeshift repair 3 days ago. The palm of his right hand, from 17 days of gripping a gladius, had developed calluses that had cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. He could no longer fully extend the fingers. Lucius was not a bad person. He was a person who had been put in a particular place for a particular length of time, and that place and that time had made him into someone he had not been before and would not be again. His contubernium, the 8-man tent group he had eaten and slept and marched with for 2 years, had lost 3 men in the first week of the street fighting. He did not think about them. There was nowhere in his mind left to put them. The orders were clear. No living combatant behind you. The Carthaginians had been coming up through sewer grates, through collapsed basement ceilings, through gaps in the rubble that opened suddenly where there had been solid wall the day before. So every room was cleared, every cistern was checked, every shadow that moved became a decision made in a fraction of a second, and the fraction of a second was never long enough for nuance. Lucius entered the room. He threw the torch first, always the torch first, not because he had been told to, but because that was what everyone did, now, without thinking about it. The room lit up. He saw what was in it. He had stopped registering what was in rooms days ago. He stepped back into the doorway and breathed the slightly less bad air of the street. Above him, somewhere on the hill, the temple of Eshmun was still standing. Inside the temple precinct, at 10 o'clock, the water was gone. The cisterns beneath the temple platform, massive underground chambers cut from the bedrock, built to supply the temple through a siege, had been the last reliable water source on Byrsa. For the last 5 days, they had also been the only water source. 900 Roman deserters, Hasdrubal's personal guard, the surviving temple priests, and several dozen civilians who had fled up the 60 steps when the lower city fell had all been drinking from them. The cisterns had run dry at sunset. In the courtyard, near the eastern wall, someone had stacked the bodies of children who had died of dehydration in the last 24 hours. They were arranged carefully, not thrown. Someone had placed their hands at their sides. Someone had still cared enough to do that. Hasdrubal's wife sat on the steps of the temple cella, the inner sanctuary where the cult statue of Eshmun stood in its niche, still bearing its gilded crown, still receiving its daily incense, despite everything. And she watched the courtyard, and she did not speak. She was wearing her best clothes. This was a decision she had made deliberately, at some point in the last 2 days, when the decision had still been possible to make. She did not know at the time why she was making it. She knew now. You put on your best clothes because you are not going to be able to put them on later. Hasdrubal was pacing. He had been pacing since nightfall, back and forth across the temple terrace, from the eastern parapet where you could see the burning streets below, to the western parapet where you could see the lights of Scipio's orderly, well-fed, well-watered camp. He had sent 2 messengers to Scipio in the last week requesting terms. Neither had returned. This did not necessarily mean they were dead. He held on to this. At 11 o'clock, the Roman advance cohorts reached the foot of the 60 steps. They did not charge up immediately. They waited. Below them, in the city, the sounds of individual combat were becoming less frequent. Not because the fighting was over, but because there was less and less left to fight over. The looting had begun. Lucius and his contubernium, 3 streets below the temple, listened to the sound of someone systematically stripping the gold inlay from the Apollo temple's interior walls, and said nothing, because the order against taking temple property had been given to officers, and this was a situation in which the distance between officers and enlisted men had become a distance of moral universes. Scipio, watching from his position at the forum below, gave the order to surround the temple of Eshmun, not to attack, to surround. He had Polybius with him, his Greek tutor, the historian who had attached himself to the general staff years before and had been recording everything. Scipio wanted to watch what happened next. What happened was this. At midnight, a figure slipped out of the side gate of the temple precinct. Alone, no guard, no aid, moving quickly, low to the ground, through the rubble between the temple wall and the Roman perimeter. 2 sentries caught him at the second line. Hasdrubal, commander of Carthage's last defense, surrendered before the temple did. He was brought to Scipio. He knelt in the dirt. He begged for his life and the lives of the deserters, offering information about the city's remaining gold reserves, the temple vaults, anything. Scipio listened. He had Hasdrubal chained and sat at his feet and left there as a display item for the morning ceremonies. On the temple roof, Hasdrubal's wife watched this happen. Polybius, standing next to Scipio, recorded what she said. Her words came down from the roof of a burning temple in a language that would be dead within a generation. We have no quarrel with you, Roman. You are only using the rights of war. But as for this Hasdrubal, who sold his country, his temples, me, and his children for a piece of bread and the right to breathe a little longer, may the gods of Carthage repay him. Go, coward. Walk behind your master's chariot in chains. We will keep our freedom here in these sacred flames. Then she threw her children into the fire. Then she jumped. The Roman deserters who had watched all of this set fire to the temple themselves. They had known from the beginning of the siege what Rome did to soldiers who changed sides. There had never been a world in which they came down those 60 steps alive. They had simply needed to be sure. The temple of Eshmun collapsed at 3 o'clock in the morning. Not all at once. First the roof, then the interior columns, then the cellar walls folding inward, then the great stone terrace at the top of the 60 steps cracking along its original fault lines, lines that had existed since the hill was first cut, centuries before anyone alive had been born. And the sound was not an explosion, but something slower. The sound of a structure that had been built to outlast everything, outlasting one last thing, and then stopping. After that, silence began. Not complete silence. The fires were still going, the low fires, the deep fires in the basements and the cistern chambers, where the wood had been burning for so long it had passed into something closer to coal than flame, and those fires would burn for days more. But the sharp sounds, the sounds of human beings fighting and dying and making noise, those were over. Carthage was still standing, technically. Most of the outer walls were intact. The 3 rings of landward fortification that had never been breached from the outside stood in the firelight. The circular military harbor's great limestone pylons still rose from the black water. The commercial harbor's quays were intact. But the city was empty. Not empty in the sense of evacuated. Empty in the sense that the thing that makes a city, the 10,000 small agreements between people, the continuous negotiation of shared space, the sound of children in the morning, the smell of bread from the public ovens, the particular shouting of the fish market, the specific argument between neighbors over a boundary wall, all of that had stopped, all at once. In 17 days, Lucius reached the top of Byrsa Hill at dawn and dropped his shield on the ground because his shoulder had been cramping for 3 days, and the injury had become permanent enough that holding the shield was no longer a question of will. He stood and looked at the harbor. The circular military harbor, the one Carthaginian engineers had spent generations perfecting, the 220-berth installation that no Mediterranean navy had ever equaled, was full of the remains of ships that had never left their hangars. The cedar roofs of the ship berths had burned and fallen into the water. Beneath the water, visible in the gray morning light, the hulls of the last Carthaginian triremes lay on the harbor bottom, their ribs showing through the surface like the bones of something very large. The yellow limestone of the harbor walls was cracked from the heat. In the cracks, there was black. Everything was either cracked or black. Lucius was 21 years old. He had grown up hearing that Rome was destined to rule the world, and he believed this, and he had no reason not to. But standing at the top of Byrsa in the early morning, looking at the harbor, looking at the 7 centuries of ash beneath his feet, he did not feel like a person who had achieved anything. He felt tired. He felt the cracked palm of his sword hand. He tasted chalk. He wanted to eat something that was not dried barley bread. He picked up his shield, because leaving it would have meant a fine, and walked back down toward the Roman camp. Scipio Aemilianus stood on the highest point of Byrsa, where the temple of Eshmun had been, as the sun came up. He was 37 years old. He was the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the general who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. He had been given this command specifically because Rome trusted the name, and because this campaign required someone who would not hesitate. He had not hesitated. Standing on the hill, watching the smoke rise from the harbor and the ruins and the streets that had ceased being streets, he called Polybius over. And he said something that Polybius wrote down, standing right there in the immediate aftermath of the thing itself. This is a glorious moment, Polybius. And yet I feel a deep, dark terror that one day the same fate will be given to my own homeland, for no empire has ever lasted. The Assyrians fell, the Medes fell, the Persians, the Macedonians, and someday someone will stand over Rome's ashes and say what I am saying now. Then he wept. He wept for Rome, not for Carthage. He had not ordered the destruction of Carthage out of cruelty or hatred. He had ordered it because the Senate required it, and because he understood power, and because understanding power meant understanding that you do not leave your rivals standing when you have the chance to ensure they never stand again. But standing on the hill, looking at what ensuring that looks like, he wept. The sun came up over the Gulf of Tunis and fell on the black harbor and the cracked limestone and the layer of ash that covered everything on Byrsa Hill, a layer that Friedrich Rachab's German Archaeological Institute team would uncover 2,100 years later, still intact, still 40 to 60 centimeters thick, still containing the calcined bone fragments and the burned cedar and the lead droplets that had fallen from the melting roof of the cisterns into the water below, still carrying the physical signature of one night in the spring of 146 BC. The ash did not go away, it went under. The Romans built a new city on top of Carthage 120 years later. Augustus's engineers graded the hill and laid a platform of yellow clay over everything, over the ash, over the bones, over the cracked cisterns, over the memory of the harbor smells, and the grain warehouses, and the market arguments, and the 40 generations of people who had lived here. And on top of the clay, they built a new form, and new temples, and new apartment blocks, and a new city with a Roman name. And for 2,100 years, the Punic burning layer sat in the dark, 3 meters underground, waiting to be found. The salt story is not true. Roman soldiers did not plow Carthaginian fields and pour salt into the ground. There is no ancient source, not Polybius, not Appian, not Livy, not Cicero, not a single Roman or Greek writer who was alive within 500 years of the event that records this. The story appears for the first time in a papal decree in 1299, 12 centuries later, as a metaphor. It was repeated by a German historian in the 1800s. It entered textbooks. It is not history. It is the thing we invented to make the destruction feel complete. The destruction did not need completing. 50,000 people were enslaved and shipped out of Africa that spring. 50,000. That number comes from Appian, who was writing 160 years after the event, drawing on sources we no longer have. 50,000 people, give or take the rounding of an ancient historian, walked out of Carthage in chains, onto Roman ships, into a world where they would spend the rest of their lives as property. Their names are not recorded. Their language, Punic, the last living descendant of ancient Phoenician, was banned in the territory Rome renamed Africa Province. It survived in the interior, in Berber communities and in isolated coastal towns until the 6th century AD. Then it stopped. 700 years of civilization. 50,000 people. One night. The pattern that ended Carthage has a name now. Thomas Schelling described it in 1966 in a book called Arms and Influence. He called it compellance, the use of coercive demands to force an adversary to disarm, to comply, to make itself progressively more helpless, while the dominant power uses that process not to reach a settlement, but to prepare for an annihilation. The weaker party is no longer capable of resisting by the time they realize what is happening. Carthage handed over its weapons in 149 BC. Czechoslovakia handed over its border fortifications and its Skoda armament factories at Munich in September of 1938. 6 months later, having been left completely defenseless by the guarantee of its own allies, it ceased to exist as a state. Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, exchanging the world's third largest nuclear arsenal for written guarantees of sovereignty from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. 20 years later, the guarantor tore up the memorandum and took the territory back. The pattern is not ancient. It is not confined to empires and armies. It is the logic of any situation in which a dominant power makes demands of a weaker one, and the weaker one calculates that compliance is safer than resistance. Sometimes that calculation is right. Sometimes it is Carthage. The question Carthage never got to answer, the question that the Senate chamber in 149 BC never really debated, because the Teslamici faction moved too fast and the Hawks moved too late, is the one Schelling's book tries to answer. How do you know, from inside the negotiation, whether you are making a compromise that will preserve you or stripping away the last thing that was keeping you alive? Carthage did not know. The cistern water tasted of ash. The spear tip was soft. The sky above the harbor was the color of something that had been burning too long, and Von Melkart, on his barricade, heard the sound of wooden planks being flung from a rooftop above him, and looked up and understood, in the 5 seconds it took for the Roman shields to appear against the red sky, that the walls had never been the problem. The problem was that he had already given up the walls that mattered. 3 years before this night, in a Senate chamber in Carthage, someone had handed Rome the answer, wrapped neatly with a diplomatic seal. They thought they were buying time. They were buying this. Scipio was right, by the way, about Rome. 322 years after he stood on the ash of Byrsa and wept, a Germanic chieftain named Alaric would stand at the gates of Rome with his Visigoths and demand ransom. Rome would pay it. He would come back. Rome would pay again. He would come back a third time, and on the third night, someone opened a gate. The name of the gate was the Salarian Gate. The name of the person who opened it, whether it was a slave, a sympathizer, or simply the guard who had stopped believing there was anything left to guard, is not recorded. We will never know who opened it, but the gate was open. Next time, the last night of Rome.